If it appears that I'm ignoring you, I'm really not. It's just one of these weeks where I have deaf in the left ear, hopefully a temporary phenomenon with a little inflammation on the inside. Doctor dug out the stuff and treated it. So just bear with me. I'm not really ignoring you or paying no attention. Hopefully it'll be resolved fairly quickly. A couple of years ago, we were under a winter weather advisory here in Northwest Arkansas. And because of the threat of freezing drizzle before and after church services, we decided to err on the side of caution by canceling the church service. Previous to that, a couple of attendees were injured when their car slid off of an icy road. Well, most of us have an opportunity to tap into one of the nationally available church service webcasts. And then recently, again, we had some inclement weather, and it wasn't safe really for many folks to drive, to travel in the snow and ice, so I recommended people make a safe decision. Well, my wife and I drove more slowly than usual on our road to church, and only a few people, fewer numbers were at people at church because of the weather. But thankfully then, by the time the church service was over, the roads had become clear and dry, and the trip home was uneventful. Well, we tend to heed the winter weather advisory that comes from the National Weather Service, and many people rely on the weather forecast because it relates to their employment or recreational activities. People's activities don't just stop because the weather is something other than just 72 degrees with sunny skies out and a warm breeze. They have to make decisions right on the edge, right on the margin, by asking themselves, should I do a particular activity or not? But what about our personal lives? How often do we check the biblical forecast to see if there's a possible hazard to our own character development? Many of us daily turn on the radio and the television or access the internet to check the weather. Even my daughters, when they were in high school and college, they checked the weather daily. Not that they were weather watchers and cared particularly, but they wanted to find out what kind of clothes they should wear that particular day, which is a pretty important thing to know. Do we have the same diligence then to turn to the pages of the Bible and see what lies ahead? Well, prophecy has long been an interest to people. Thousands of years, people have looked to seers and soothsayers and prophets. Inquiring minds want to know what the future holds in store for them. And despite this human curiosity about the future, many folks underestimate or even dismiss biblical prophecy. In Grant Jeffrey's book, The Signature of God, he notes that about 27% of the Bible is prophecy. The Bible contains, as he writes, the Bible contains 1,817 individual predictions concerning 737 separate subjects found in 8,352 verses. These numerous predictions comprise 27% of the verses in the whole of the Scriptures. Multitudes of biblical scholars over the last 2,000 years have explored many of these prophecies and their detailed fulfillment as proven by ample historical evidence. Well, that's what one guy said, so I turned to the Encyclopedia of Biblical Prophecy by J. Barton Payne, and he writes, and he adds them up. He just said, instead of the total number, he says 1,239 prophecies in the Old Testament and 578 in the New Testament, for a total of 1,817 prophecies in the Bible. And his calculation was that the prophecy constituted 26.8% of the Bible, pretty close to the 27%. Well, this strong interest in prophecy that people have is reflected on the number of hits to messages on our own Northwest Arkansas UCG YouTube channel. As of this morning, to date, the top 6 YouTube video messages have produced 6,387 hits. Those views as of this morning, that's 3,000 more views than the same messages had accumulated 2 years ago. Interestingly enough, all 6 videos are about prophecy. Well, what is our responsibility regarding prophecy? Is prophecy something that's vital to our understanding of God? Is discerning prophecy necessary for us to become good Christians? To answer these questions, let's go back and look at the example of observing the weather and checking the weather forecast. How we dress each day may depend on the weather. How we pack for a trip depends on the climate or weather at the other end of our trip, the destination. Our physical comfort and even our survival can depend on how well prepared we are to deal with that weather. The same is true with regarding our spiritual lives, our spiritual weather. How well prepared are we to deal with the issues of the day if we fail to understand the big picture of God's plan? Now, not everyone watches the weather. Some people just stumble out into the elements and they suffer because they're unprepared. Similarly, not everyone studies prophecy. For them, prophecy is hard to understand because they don't take time to see how the plan of God is revealed. The Apostle Peter wrote in 1 Peter 1, verse 10, he wrote that the biblical prophets of old were prophesying for our benefit, even though they may not have fully understood what they were writing. If we turn to 2 Timothy 3:16, we read that the scriptures, the ones that we know now as the Old Testament, are profitable for four things: doctrine, reproof, for correction, and instruction in righteousness. These Old Testament prophets were like spiritual weather forecasters. The prophet Isaiah wrote in Isaiah 32, verse 3, he wrote about the understanding that comes to those who pay attention to the world around them. In Isaiah 32:3, the eyes of those who see will not be dim, and the ears of those who hear will listen. If you're paying attention, you can see it. If you're listening, you will hear it. And even when we do pay attention, we study and focus on the scriptures, we must realize that not all knowledge is revealed in one fell swoop. We must invest effort to learn that truth is revealed as in pieces to a puzzle. In Isaiah 28:10, we are instructed to understand that we are responsible for connecting the dots by reading the whole Bible. In Isaiah 28:10, for precept must be upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, here a little, there a little. So it's putting these things together that helps us to understand the whole picture. We turn to Psalm 119, 148. In Psalm 119, 148, the psalmist wrote, "My eyes are awake through the night watches, that I may meditate on your word." Here's a young shepherd boy, the future King David. He was watching for something, and he had in mind, he was meditating on the word of God. What was he watching for as a young man? And later, what was he watching for when he was the king of Israel? Well, as a shepherd, his job was to care for the sheep. He was watching for predators that would kill or harm the sheep. As the king, he was the leader of the army of Israel. He was responsible for the safety and security of the nation and was watchful, therefore. What did Christ instruct us to be watchful for? We can turn to chapter 24 in the book of Matthew. Chapter 24 in the book of Matthew. And I want to go through some of this to tell us, which explains to us the importance of following and understanding prophecy. Matthew 24, starting in verse 3. Now he sat on the Mount of Olives. The disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of this age?" Verse 4, and Jesus answered and said to them, "Take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For the nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines, pestilences, earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Do you see any prophecies in there? I do. Nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom, famines, pestilences, earthquakes, not just in one place, but in many. In verse 9, we go on, and they will deliver you up to the tribulation, meaning the deceivers, and kill you, and you will be hated for all nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended, betray one another, and will hate one another. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. Notice it doesn't say false prophets will rise up here and there, and a few people will be swept away by that. It uses the word many. And because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will wax cold. Does that mean a few? It means many, deceived. And what goes away when they're deceived? The love of the brethren, the love of each other. That, as the wax cools. Now, I bought a little packet of aromatic wax containers when I was at the feast in Estonia last year. Little cinnamon type things, a little something to take home. And it was like $1, so I thought I wasn't investing too much. And I put this little scent, lit the scent in my classroom yesterday. It's just a little tiny, about the size of a little bigger than a quarter or so, and to get this aromatic scent of the cinnamon in the classroom. And I thought, whatever I do not want to trip the fire alarm. Anything that comes up, it won't take much. They're pretty sensitive. And whatever I do, I don't want to tip this over. I don't want to do anything. And sure enough, you know how it is when the best of intentions sometimes don't always work out. I tipped it over. Just a little thing. It's easy to tip. And the wax was all melted and just spread out over the table. How quickly it became solid. The heat was no longer there. The fire was no longer there. And yet it solidified as it spread over the desktop. And this is what we're talking about here. The love of many will grow cold. The wax stiffened up. It was no longer in the container. It wasn't useful to be the candle. It wasn't useful to feed the light. Verse 13, Matthew 24:13, but he who endures to the end shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached into all the world as a witness to all nations. And then will the end come. So we've got more prophecies that will come along here. There'll be more false prophets. They will be deceptive. The love of many will grow cold, and that the gospel will be preached to all the world as a witness. And the prophecy of the end of this age will come. Verse 15. We have more prophecy. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, which means whoever reads, let him understand. That's what Daniel said. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. So the local people in Judea were giving specific instructions. And woe to those, and to him who's in the field, don't go back to get your clothes. And those who are pregnant, woe to those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. For then there will be great affliction, such as not been since the beginning of the world until this time, nor shall ever be. Seems like there's prophecies there too for those people who are in that place at that time. Unless we continue on, unless those days be shortened, no flesh saved alive, but for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. And it goes on to describe, as we go through Matthew 24, other prophecies that are going to be very specific. Verse 23, if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, or there, don't believe it. For the false Christ and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonder to deceive, if possible, even the elect. Is it possible? Well, Christ is saying if it's possible, then they would also be deceived. So I guess our job is to make sure that it's to reduce that chance of possibility. And verse 25, see, I've told you beforehand. In other words, I'm telling you this is what's going to happen. Verse 26, therefore if they say to you, meaning the false prophets, look, he's in the desert, don't go out, or look, he's in the inner rooms, don't believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and flushes to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. So now there's a prophecy on what that's going to be like. How is that Christ's coming going to be? For wherever the carcass is, the eagles will be gathered together. Verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven and the powers of the heavens be shaken. I suppose everyone will know that event will occur. It's not like this is going to be a secret. If the sun is dark, my brother said we drove X number of miles last summer to get to see the eclipse of the sun in order to be able to, these opportunities that swept across middle America. The sun was indeed darkened. We had an eclipse, the moon passed in front of the sun here a couple of years ago at my school, and it was really odd during the day, and I took pictures of the shadow that occurred as this of the trees, and there were duplicates. It's like layer upon layer, and many of you may have also done so, of this odd circumstance. But the oddest stuff is yet to come. I have a family history book that was a history of the McLeod County in 1917 that wrote of all the pioneer families in that county in Minnesota and the story of their history. And in the history book is recorded a couple of paragraphs that are remarkably unusual. And it said, there was a day when people could look in the sky and they could see what was going on 40, 45 miles away in the Minnesota River Valley. It was as if a mirror or a reflection in the sky. Now, some atmospheric condition was there, and this old history book was saying you could see farmers behind their horses and implements in the field. And everybody stopped and in awe. And it went on to say some people thought it was the end of the age. This was it. Strange things that they were seeing. Well, this was certain. This was before the age of television, before the age of internet. And so to see what was happening live 40 miles away was a remarkable happenstance. They recognized the landscape and the flow of the river. It was like a camera looking down from the sky. And people were contemplating suicide to avoid the calamity that they knew was going to come. Remarkable few paragraphs in this old history book. Verse 30 in Matthew 24, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, and he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So we're told this is what's going to happen. This is how it's going to happen. There's some details that are going to be filled in. Verse 32, now learn this parable from the fig tree. When the branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know the summer is near. Verse 33, catch my verse here. So also, you also, when you see all of these things, know it's near. Well, how do you know when these things are coming? Just like when you know that there's a fig coming, there's now leaves coming. Many years ago, there was an old neighbor farmer who offered me his farm for sale. I, being a young man, thought it was a pretty good deal. And he was an old fellow, and he gave me some advice. He was a weather watcher. And he told me that you plant corn when an oak leaf is the size of a squirrel's ear, because he watched the weather every day. Well, I thought that was good advice. What he didn't realize was that had a lot to do with the soil temperature and when the tree would be bringing forth its new leaves. But he knew from the world around him, he was watchful. He could predict when a good time to plant would be. And he said, always plant your soybeans by the dark side of the moon. Now, did he know why? I don't know if he knew the scientific reason. But by the dark side of the moon is when it could be freezing weather out in May. And if you plant at the dark side of the moon, it'll take a day or two for the soybeans to come up. And they aren't going to freeze, but beans are very tender. And if they freeze after you plant them, those tender shoots will freeze off, and that's it. They aren't going to come back. And it's only later we learned some of the scientific reasons for that to be so. I was planting soybeans 20-some years ago, and I'm in the field planting, and a neighbor comes driving by, and he said, "Isn't it too early to plant soybeans?" And I said, "Augustado said, you plant by the dark side of the moon." And I said, so I'm busy, putting in the beans. And I said, "When are you planting soybeans?" He says, "I'm going home now to do it." Because there was a reason for this prediction that was pretty stable and had been true over the years. So get back to my page. Verse 36, beware of the day an hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away. So also will the coming of the Son of Man be. Then 2 men will be in a field, one will be taken, the other will be left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, and one will be taken, the other left. Watch therefore that you do not know what hour your Lord is coming, but know this, that if the master of the house had known what the hour the thief would have come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. Therefore you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming in an hour you do not expect. And we go on for the rest of the chapter. It continues in that mode. And you know that in the Gospels there is some repetition. In Luke 12, Luke 12, verses 37 through 40, emphasizes this. Blessed are those servants whom the master, when he comes, will find watching. Isn't that the way it is sometimes? If you know somebody's going to be watching, you're going to be more careful. As a kid, I never thought about it, but my parents raised 4 boys. We were all teenagers at the same time. We lived 8 miles from the nearest town. And for some reason, they always stopped and called and said, "We'll be home in 15 minutes. And it was only as a parent I realized why they made the call. We should straighten up the house, clean up any mess or evidence that we had of any evidence of things that weren't normal, and get everything straight so by the time they got home, they wouldn't have to deal with it." Now when I'm looking back years later, I'm saying, that was pretty clever of them. Call up, "We'll be home in 15 minutes. And I just wondered about that at the time. So we then were watchful. We were saying, well, we know when someone's coming, so we need to straighten up. As then we seek to honor God and build our Christian lives, let's stay physically safe when we watch the weather forecast, and let's stay spiritually safe by watching the spiritual forecast. Well, after our church service today, we'll remain seated for a sermon discussion time. We'll divide into groups to discuss and answer the following questions. So we'll hand these out, but I want to give you some think time. What prophecies have already been fulfilled? Which prophecy will be fulfilled next? Which prophecy do you find the most unusual? And which exact prophecy is the most concerning to you?